Well, good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome to Bite-Sized Corrosion, and welcome back to our 2023 summer school on cathodic protection, which we've titled Out on Sight, Not Out of Mind. Today we're continuing our 6-session series as we look at the implications of our cathodic protection data. What can we understand from what we get out of our CP system? I'm going to be welcoming Neil Webb back to the microphone, and we titled today, A Change is as Good as a Holiday, because Neil is on holiday in the bush. So Neil, welcome.
Hi there, Vanessa.
Now, I love the word holiday because it has the vacation implication to those of us in South Africa. But within the corrosion sector, holiday has a completely different name. And so let's discuss a little bit, what is a holiday and what bearing does it have on my cathodic protection and its data?
Oh, that's an interesting one, because the term holiday, as far as I have been able to establish, has absolutely no resemblance to what we term holiday, which is a break from work. So holidays in the coatings industry are more officially known as electrical insulation defects, EIDs. In other words, it's a break in the coating, and maybe that's where the term holiday comes from. It's a break in the coating where the environment is able to penetrate through to the substrate. And on pipelines, we go to great lengths to limit the number of holidays on a pipeline, because every holiday represents a low resistance path for the electrolyte to get to the steel substrate, and therefore it requires current from the cathodic protection system in order to prevent corrosion at that particular location.
So if we have holidays on our coating, our CP system doesn't get a holiday, I guess. What implication is that going to have on our data? So if we've got a poor coating now because it has holidays in it, how will we know? How do they get there? Perhaps might be an associate question, but what implication is it going to be and how can I spot it?
Spotting individual holidays, of course, goes back to overline survey techniques, which is another series which we covered in great depth. I think it was this time last year, and encourage you guys to go and have a look at that, because that tells us how we actually find these holidays. But holidays as a group impact the current requirements of the cathodic protection system. So the more holidays you have, the more power you need for your cathodic protection system. And the net result then is that the CP system is working harder in order to protect the pipeline.
So Neil, we're going to need more current to protect our pipeline, but a holiday doesn't get manufactured or made in an instant. Presumably this is a long drawn out process, and in that regard, I presume we're not going to see the change on our CP system very quickly, but we'll see it over time.
Very much so. The holidays present will result in an increase in the current requirements of the CP system, but those holidays are there. And so once you've established the level of cathodic protection needed for a particular pipeline, then over a long period of time, that coating will degrade. All coatings will degrade. Some degrade faster than others, but even the worst of the coatings take years and years and years to degrade. And it's not necessarily that you get more holidays, because the holidays themselves primarily are the result of mechanical damage, perhaps, during installation of the pipeline. But you may well find that holidays increase in size as water penetrates through the coating and reaches the substrate. If you've got a CP system that's driving too hard, it may tend to increase the size of a holiday due to cathodic desponding, which is a subject for another day. But all of that is a long, slow process. So the effect of the holidays is a long-term situation that gradually results in an increase in the current requirement for the pipeline.
So it's not that I'm measuring well, I know we're talking current, but I measure the protection on my pipe with a pipe to cell potential. So it's not that I measure -1 volts today and minus, say, 900 millivolts with copper sulfate next week and go, oh, that's because we've got holidays. But rather, when I compare it over several years, that I can start to deduce and draw those conclusions. So I guess that highlights again something that we speak about on many of these sessions, the importance of keeping your records, not just for this month, last month reconciliation, but also to look over the years.
Yeah, the situation you described, you could say, oh, well, if somebody interferes with the pipeline and they dig it up or are working in the area and they accidentally come across the pipeline and scrape the pipeline with a back actor, that's going to create one huge holiday. But that one huge holiday is minuscule in the big picture. So even a step change such as mechanical damage is not necessarily going to reflect in the operation of the pipeline. So step changes are a completely different story to holidays. And those step changes due to or localized incidents due to mechanical damage, or particularly a sudden particular increase in the size of a holiday, that's something that you pick up with close interval surveys or DCPG surveys or one of the overline survey techniques, not with the overall operation of the CP system. If I can give you an example, the Durban-Johannesburg oil pipelines were laid in the 1960s and 70s. And over the years, they've been well protected. And it was only in the early 2000s, so 30 years later, that the operators were able to see that the coating was starting to degrade to the point that the CP system was no longer able to cope. So that's 30 years of operation over which the gradual deterioration has taken place.
And speaks to that, keeping the records for 30 years and going back and looking at them to be able to draw that kind of information. The degradation of our coating draws extra on our CP system, but other variations can also occur. I'm thinking you've got seasonal changes, telluric currents. Obviously seasonal changes are sort of twice a year, or in most places telluric currents, which are sort of over a 24-hour period. How do those influence the data that we see, and how can we evaluate our data to pick up those kinds of interference?
Well, those changes result in changes in the recorded corrosion potential or cathodic protection potential that we get from our cathodic protection monitoring systems. And depending on the type of interference or the cause of those changes will determine the changes that we see in the potentials. So as we spoke about last week, potential monitoring is really the kingpin of cathodic protection. And when we monitor our potentials, we can then see what is changing. And the things that you have mentioned are all causes of changes in potential. So, for example, if you were to monitor the potential of a pipeline or a structure overnight and have a look at it the next morning, you may pick up variations due to traction movement, which is caused by DC rail systems in the vicinity, and you see fluctuations in the potential with a period, generally minutes, because it takes a few minutes for a train to pass a particular point. If you were wanting to find out whether your potentials were affected by temperature, for example, and you may think, well, that's not very relevant. Well, if you were, for example, measuring the potential of a tank, where it's an above ground storage tank, and you're monitoring the potential of the tank base, which has got cathodic protection on it, the temperature of that tank may fluctuate either daily due to the effect of the sun, or it may fluctuate due to the temperature of product, which is stored in those tanks. You get heated tanks for heavy fuel oil, for example. So in that case, you would want to monitor the potential over a period of several days in order to see what the changes are. If you then think about the effect of seasonal changes, well, I don't know about everywhere, but certainly in Gauteng, in South Africa, we have a wet season and a dry season. And it is very dry in the dry season and it's very wet in the wet season. So this causes changes in the characteristics of the ground, and those changes will result in increases and or decreases in the potential of the structure. Again, depending on the style of cathodic protection that is actually installed. So when the resistivity of the ground goes down, it becomes more conductive due to higher moisture content. You may find that the corrosion rates increase and the cathodic protection potentials deteriorate during the wet season. But at the same time, that increase in moisture reduces the resistance of the anodes. So whether it's an impressed current system or sacrificial anode system, the anodes are now going to produce more current because the resistance has dropped. And that will tend to counteract the seasonal variation. But if you want to analyze the seasonal variation, you have to look at the variation over an annual cycle, not a daily cycle or even a monthly cycle.
So then we would, for example, just going back to your discussion about stray currents, you would then compare your potential over, say, a 24-hour period, and on a graph you can visually see if your structure potential is being affected by the stray currents, whereas your seasonal variations, you'd have to gather data, say, every month over a year, and by plotting that data, you could then see whether there is an influence if you're taking your potentials obviously at the same location to rule out other influences.
Well, you've actually raised two further points there. One very, very important point is the same location. If you move your reference electrode by a meter, you're going to get a different result if you're using a portable reference electrode. So from that point of view, stationary reference electrodes or fixed monitoring points, where you make sure that you always put the reference electrode in the same place when you're taking measurements, will help to reduce the scatter in the collection of readings. The second very important point is, how do you compare a graph with a graph when the graphs themselves are already a function of time, say over 24 hours, and now you want to plot the graphs themselves over a period of 12 months. It becomes quite a challenging exercise, and you then have to develop parameters that you can extract from the graphs, like, for example, average potential or maximum potential or minimum potential or a weighted average potential or percentage time more negative than, or something like that, which reduces the graph to a single number. Then you can plot that number over an extended period of time to see whether you are going to pick up any actual variations.
I think that's quite helpful, Neil. Thank you. And I think it's also worthy just to comment that it appears very easy to pop out to your structure, your pipeline, your tank, and take a single spot reading and determine that that is the potential of your structure. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with a structure that is subjective to stray current interference, you're on a hiding to nothing just by doing that. But if your structure has over time been determined that it has pretty stable potential, that may well be something that you can do. And again, it's analyzing historical data to determine whether or not that is a valid way to measure your potential of your structure and use it as a representative number for this month's survey.
Yes, and that applies not only to the cathodic protection potential, but also particularly to AC. So we've spoken about AC corrosion and the hazards associated with AC potentials, either in terms of steady state touch potentials or potentials where people are subjected to electrical shock. And I encourage people to go and have a look at the LinkedIn data that Craig Puerta has been putting up recently, which is very, very nice illustration of the challenges of AC interference and the dangers associated with it. But the level of AC interference, the steady state interference, which is what is the biggest risk from corrosion and also from shock, steady state shock, that depends on the load on the power line. So you cannot take a spot potential and say, this is my AC interference level, because you don't know what the loading on the power line is at that moment in time. How are you going to find it out? Contact the power line utility and say, excuse me, what was the loading on power line XYZ at 13 minutes past 4 on the 27th of September 2022? And they'll say, depends on the power line utility, I suppose. In terms of AC, you also need to record over not 24 hours, but 48 or even 72 hours to pick up what the power line loading is.
So I think that also just highlights the importance of knowing what you're looking for before you determine how long you're going to record your data for. If you're looking for a quick indication, a spot potential may be adequate. If you're looking for AC, then you do want to leave your data loggers running for, as you say, for a couple of days to determine what a fair reflection is. And particularly with AC, we tend to use the maximum value because that's the value of greatest risk rather than the average value, where I've observed that with cathodic protection, we often use the average values because those are the ones that are indicative of our protection levels over time.
Well, certainly with AC as well, average values are important from the corrosion point of view, but maximum values are important from a personnel safety point of view. Yeah. And then you need to look at the concept of telluric interference. You alluded to it. And it's something we don't see a lot of in South Africa, but it certainly is something that occurs in many, many places in the world. And it usually occurs in pipelines that run east to west, and it occurs in pipelines that run from inland to the coast. Now, that's just an empirical observation. And the effect of telluric currents, which is solar wind, effectively, certainly will be a 24-hour period. So again, you've got to monitor this over a number of days, a minimum of 24 hours. And usually, if something's going to last for a 24-hour cycle, you want to record more than one cycle. And so you run that for several days. Solar flares, they happen. And yeah, you've got to have that data and compare it or get information from your local space watch laboratories or observatories in order to find out what is the influence of the solar wind or what has been the sunspot activity. And yeah, we've seen it, but it's never been significant in our particular field. But certainly it's a major problem on some CP systems.
Well, I recall several years ago you mentioning telluric currents to me when I first came across them. And subsequent to that, I was able to review some data that had been taken for an extended period of time. And changes in the data that I'd just put down to stray currents, I started to see the pattern over a couple of days that maybe it is telluric currents, and we tend to perhaps find them masked to some extent by our intense stray current activity. But yeah, when you go looking for it, you can see, or even if it's not necessarily telluric currents, but influences of day-night changes as well. When you start looking at the data, you do definitely see these daytime, nighttime shifts.
Yes, the other thing that we see happening is an increase in faults on electrical systems during periods of high solar activity. So you find your fuses blowing and things like that happening on pipelines that are subject to telluric interference.
It goes back to when I started in the industry and someone said, oh, cathodic protection is just a black box of magic arts. And when you start talking about sun flares influencing the blowing of fuses and stuff, it really does start to sound all hocus pocusy.
Yeah.
What are some of the parameters that we can look at or should be looking at perhaps when we are evaluating our data? Should we be looking at specific values? Should we be looking at guidelines between values? Any pointers in that regard?
There are always the operating tramlines, if you can call them that, the boundaries within which CP is known to be effective. So we have the boundaries of minus 850 millivolts with respect to copper sulfate as the basic level of cathodic protection, and the minus 950 if you are under the influence of sulfate-producing bacteria or at higher temperatures. And then you have the upper parameter of minus 1150, which is hotly debated about whether that's a real limit or not. And they say, how on earth can you limit it when your pipeline's running at several volts negative? How can you tell me that minus 1150 is an upper limit? And that's a whole discussion session on its own. But that minus 1150 is the interface potential that we want to measure. And that goes back to how you measure. How do you actually take your measurements? And that goes back to the underlying subject of this series is, do you know what you're measuring? Are you measuring it properly? Are you interpreting your measurements properly? So yes, we have things like, for example, on a big project a few years ago, during construction, we operated the temporary cathodic protection system on the basis that the object of the temporary protection was to maintain the pipeline at more negative than minus 1 volt on. In other words, with the cathodic protection system operation, whether it be temporary sacrificial anode cathodic protection or temporary rectifiers or whatever. And that philosophy worked. There's a philosophy that's applied in Switzerland where they operate their pipelines at a particular level, which is not minus 850 or 950 or 1150. They operated at a particular level of on potential. And they use that as a parameter. There are many ways of skinning this cat, but you've got to find out what the parameter is, what it means, what its relevance is, and how to apply it.
You know, we could talk for ages, and we've really only spoken to the impact of gradual changes. And I think tomorrow we can maybe take a step into another discussion and look at step changes in our data. What happens when either my rectifier or my pipeline potential changes dramatically? What does it mean? Where is it going to take me? But I think today's discussion has been really helpful, so thank you.
I think the point about that is twofold. If you've got a step change, it needs investigation. That's the most important part. We'll talk tomorrow about what the changes can mean. And secondly, if you don't have records, you don't know you've got to change. And I think that has been the absolute crucial, most important message to come out of this whole series is records.
Exactly. And don't throw out the old when you're changing the guard. Just hang on to those records. They're so valuable. Thank you so much, Neil.